Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. It's Wednesday, April 30th, 2025, and today we're going to be answering 3 questions we've been hearing from international educators over the last 7 days. And what a 7 days it's been. We'll talk about the main news stories and how that impacts the questions that we're asking today in a minute. But I first want to say thank you to all of you who have been subscribing to our newsletter that comes out on Mondays. There are 2 forms of that newsletter, either through our website at smieconsulting.org/subscribe. And you can go to the subscribe tab on that page, enter in your details, and get the email version of the newsletter delivered to your email inbox on Monday morning at about 9 o'clock Eastern Time. There is also a LinkedIn version to the newsletter, and that is available at about 8:30 in the morning, depending on how LinkedIn decides to send it out. Sometimes it's a little later, sometimes it's earlier, but at 8:30 a.m. Eastern on Mondays, you'll get the LinkedIn version. Now, between the 2 versions of this newsletter, there are over 2,500 subscribers currently, so really excited that so many international educators are getting this newsletter as part of their international edification each week. Had some really positive compliments on this week's newsletter from some folks I've known for quite a while that have been reading, faithful readers, thankfully, of the newsletter, and they were sharing out their positive feedback. So really appreciate that. It makes a difference to hear those comments and keeps me energized to keep delivering this content week after week. So if you're wondering about that newsletter, it has 4 or 5 different sections, primary of which is the social media news, where it covers how social media is being used in international education, covers AI topics in international ed, covers upcoming webinars, digital reports, online blogs from international educators that I like to share on a regular basis. Then it has 3 other main sections. U.S. News Central, that has what the current news topics of the week are, and how we can potentially, providing you my hot takes on those on Mondays. We also have a Solutions Central section that talks about some of the ways that international educators are making use of some of the data that's out there and moving in positive directions. And then there's a global roundup. And why is that important? Because we live in a global world, an increasingly smaller world, where particularly our field, international education, what happens here is dependent a lot on what goes on around the world, and how we approach the world is dependent on how they are individually responding to different aspects of international education in their own countries. So the roundup today on Wednesdays takes themes we see developing in the newsletter on the previous Monday, and we come up with 3 questions each week that kind of allow us to go next level into some of the details over the next half hour on how these topics, these themes, these questions can be answered, and how we can respond to them in our jobs in international education, particularly here in the U.S. So let's get right into it with our first question of the day. What's next after SEVIS termination reversals? And those of you who were paying attention to your news feeds on Friday, you saw quite a bit of news coming in the early afternoon that had to do with the government, this actually was happening as part of a court case that was being heard. Department of Homeland Security attorney was arguing before courts that they were basically losing a court case that had to do with some of the students that had been suing the government for their wrongful SEVIS terminations, those auto terminations that occurred without due process, without any review, just an automatic termination that jeopardized their status. We had one assistant U.S. attorney argue in Detroit at one of those court cases that just because their SEVIS records were terminated didn't mean they were out of status, and that was the biggest joke that ISSS folks had ever heard. And what happened next was we saw that the government was clearly losing the argument. They realized they'd made some pretty stupid mistakes in authorizing this AI bot to go crawling through government criminal records or any kind of infractions of even parking tickets, how they got into these records in the first place. We get how they get into them, but why they went even so set the parameters for these AI searches down to parking tickets is ridiculous. That SEVIS, the SEVIS database tracks immigration status of students, whether they're maintaining full-time studies, their work authorization, all of these things that are relevant to their status. That's what that database tracks, not whether they have a parking ticket or a speeding ticket, and as a result should be that might have been resolved and settled, or any court cases that might have been settled that were non-criminal in nature. These are the things that the government has realized they made terrible mistakes, and they were losing the courts, and would continue to see these court cases go against them. And there were plenty of them. There were over 65 different court cases brought by universities and students against the government for their improper and unlawful termination of their status. So this is, though the DHS is saying they're not done, they're going to come back and figure out a way to build a review process, which should have happened in the first place. They just got ahead of themselves, way over their skis, and they fell tumbling down the hill and created a big snowball effect that did way more damage than the good it might have potentially been intended to do, and we don't even really believe that for a second in most of our international ed circles. So we see the government stepping back, reorganizing, and they've done this before in the first Trump administration. They did this after the travel bans got knocked back by the courts. They came back and rejigged them and put in exemptions for students and other things that NAFTA and other advocates for international education argued for. So we see government kind of going back and figuring out, and there may well be legitimate ways where that there needs to be a process in place, because right now it's all dependent on DSOs, PDSOs entering information into SEVIS that then if they're below full-time status for a period of time, if they've not updated their address, they haven't gotten a job, whatever it is, that can potentially lead to a student going out of SEVIS status. What they will probably like to try and build into it is some kind of overlap with actual criminal databases where felony convictions are connected and not only and tried and convicted of crimes though as grounds for removal, and particularly on the anti-Semitism bent that the government is currently on. So we'll see if that materializes, but clearly they failed. They overreached, and the knockback is forcing them to do a rethink. Now, what will happen next is that they're going to go back and they'll try and figure something else out. But what we are left dealing with, particularly on the recruitment side, international student recruitment, international student admissions, international enrollment management in general, we're dealing with the reputational damage that has been done, because the unpredictable and the unforeseen nature of this change, these auto terminations that were clearly wrong, has damaged the U.S.'s reputation around the world in certain countries. Not all countries, and this is the peculiarities of how international education functions in this world and how the U.S. is viewed. There are countries, and I had this conversation just yesterday when I was on campus at the University of Akron, where I work full-time. I had this conversation with my PDSO colleague and shared that there are countries around the world where this kind of authoritarian leadership that we're seeing here in the United States is normal, and that governments make capricious decisions and students roll with it and families roll with it. And there are countries in East and South Asia where this isn't seen as that unusual. There are countries in the Western world, in Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, obviously, that are particularly offended by what the government has done, and they've reacted very, very much against the current government in the United States. So The damage is and will continue to be done as long as this government takes actions that are not based in law, that are based on capriciousness and a fervent anti-immigrant sentiment that has gripped the hold of the administration, particularly by some senior White House officials. And no naming names, but his initials are SM. And people like that who have the ear of the president and have been drawn into this are kind of not the brains, I don't want to give them that much credit, but are the motivation for a lot of what these policies have been, are frankly doing more harm than good to the U.S.'s reputation, particularly when it comes to international education. We've seen the assault in general from this administration on higher education. A lot of higher ed leaders have been afraid to speak out, particularly at public universities, but in red states especially. But you see now there beginning to be a groundswell of support amongst universities against what the administration is doing and pushing back. And the pushback has happened and led to these reversals of the SEVIS terminations. So what will happen next with these, it's still unclear. In terms of long-term impact, will it be forgotten in 6 months? Only if there's not something else that replaces it and causes further damage, like potential travel bans or various levels of travel bans from individuals from 43 countries that have been in the works for more than 2 months now, but haven't yet been released or made official. There wasn't any warning time with the SEVIS terminations. You would hope there'd be some warning time with these travel bans, particularly with the summer travel coming up for students. If their countries were on any of those lists, most of us are recommending don't travel because of the potential difficulties of getting back in or not being able to get back in at all. And that students are placed in a very difficult situation now to whether to stick or go, stick or twist. And this is something that we need to be sensitive to, and our international offices are dealing with these issues right now, and summer travel and what's coming next with the travel bans, if that actually happens before most of us leave. And that's going to be happening in the next 2 to 3 weeks for most of us. So we'll see what happens with these, what's next. And goodness knows it's not the end of what potentially would be coming. We've got 3 3/4 more years of this left to respond to. But a couple of articles I'd like to share with you today is an upcoming webinar, May 7th, so a week from today at 2 p.m. Eastern, so right after the Midweek Roundup next week, is International Officers in the Hot Seat. It's a Chronicle webinar. Karen Fisher is leading, and support from Keystone. There is also there was some really good insight from Inside Higher Ed on some of the lessons, what they've learned from the SEVIS terminations, that the data set is growing, but there's still a lot of information not there. They had identified, I think, 1,500 last Friday before the records got shifted up or started to be reinstated. But the Chronicle was saying there are 4,500 students that were affected in this initial SEVIS terminations phase. We see the articles that we're sharing now are certainly the ones that we'll talk more about what happened with these terminations, and then what the government might be doing next. But we are also seeing that there aren't all. I mean, with what we're dealing with at Akron, we had 3 students that were impacted. 2 got their statuses reinstated on Thursday night. The final one had his restored, I think, on late Friday or over the weekend. And the problem was he had already left the country, and we're trying to figure out how to get him back in now. Not sure if his visa that was revoked after the SEVIS record was terminated, whether that automatically gets reinstated. So there's a lot of unknowns yet, particularly for those who left the country. We had a student, one of the initial 2 that was reinstated on Thursday last week, was on OPT, and his OPT was restored as well. So there is some positivity there. However, we are seeing we are seeing that not everybody has seen 100% reinstatement yet. There may be some other oddballs that aren't, or not oddballs, but just different potential equations in the mix that we're not fully aware of. But what we're dealing with now, frankly, is something that is beyond just welcoming those students back in whatever way we can, or allowing them to fully resume their duties and what that looks like. There has been damage done because some, as you've heard, some already were told by their institutions you have to self-deport in a certain number of days. Others who decided to stay and fight it, they may have been prohibited from continuing classes. They may, if they were on OPT, they might have lost their job because of this SEVIS termination. So there are consequences. The cost of having to go home for those that left and potentially re-enter. Any other additional costs the students might have had to bear on campus. All of those are the unintended consequences of this reversal. That who's going to pay for that? The government's not going to do that. Not the way that we would hope that they would make up for their error, clear error, and reimburse students for the expenses. I'm sure there may be some lawsuits pending that might do that, but that should never have happened in the first place. Is the point, and I think that's something that as international educators, though we're grateful that these terminations have been reversed, we're dealing with students who have frankly lost a little bit of trust in the government. We're doing all we can as institutions, but are they seeing the real results? Are the students feeling it? That confidence return, that trust rebuilt? Is that really happening? The answer is probably no. Will it ever be 100% the same again? Probably not. And what we're dealing with is really a good segue into our second question today, and that is, do we do a good job calming students' fears? And when we talk about fears, this is something that fears are based on how a student perceives a given situation, impacts them directly. And my good friend and colleague Rajika Bandari also recently announced that she's won the John Hudzik Award, NAFSA Award for Outstanding International Education Contributions. Good friend, and so well deserved that she's achieved that award, and we'll get it at the San Diego NAFSA at the end of March, or excuse me, end of May, in just a month's time. But she wrote a column this past week for her company, America Calling, a take on the intersection of education, culture, and migration. That's her blog. That follows on from her successful book, America Calling, Foreign Student in a Country of Possibility. And the topic of this blog post from last week is the baggage you can't check, fear. And in it, she makes some very legitimate arguments that whether it's waiting for that visa appointment at the embassy, standing in line, and that fear that they have that their whole world could come crashing down if they don't get this visa. It could be for students who are on campus when those that participated in Black Lives Matter movements and after the George Floyd murder, whether they got involved in that. If they might have been drawing attention to themselves, particularly if they got involved in the pro-Palestine, potentially pro-Hamas protests post October 7th over 2023. So we see them kind of finding their voice, but also becoming a little bit more cautious about whether to engage or not, and that's a reality they're now facing. That what Rajika's point in her blog is that the developments over the past month, this is a quote from her blog, over the past month have effectively silenced the international student voice. Because for those students that had become politically active, not all students are, and a very small minority have been, and that's okay. And many of the reasons why students don't tend to draw attention to themselves is because we've heard this for years from Chinese students that are in the United States. They would never say anything against the Chinese government, because the Chinese government does have spies in this country, particularly within a lot of Chinese student associations on campus that are agents of the government that are monitoring student behavior and reporting back to Beijing or to officials about students that might say anything pro-Tibet independence or pro Xinjiang minority Uyghur groups or any other human rights abuses in China. Students who stand up for those cases are oftentimes targeted. So they're coming from cultures where it's not okay to really speak their mind. So I think what a lot of students are realizing is it's best not to muddy the waters or stir up conflict, even though we pride ourselves on our campuses as being bastions of free speech and allowing for the open discussion of ideas. The reality is these students who've come to the United States have so much riding, their futures are riding on their time here, on their ability to study, on the funds that their parents and families are paying to allow them to be in the country and to take these degrees, that they don't want to mess that up. And that's what Rajika's point is, that their voices are being silenced, that they will not take the steps to let their voices be heard, even though they might fully support some of the decisions or some of the protest ideas that are being floated. Certainly, students from the Middle East certainly become very much targeted for their views, particularly on this issue of Palestine, and had an interesting conversation. And this is probably reflective of where most students lie on this issue, or not lie as in say or be untruthful, but where they sit is a student from Jordan who's in the United States now. He's on scholarship from the university. That if he didn't have it, he wouldn't be able to stay. I met with him a couple weeks ago and had the discussion on what is all the demonstrations that have been going on campus. It hadn't really been open violent protests on his campus, but I asked him the question: what is it? How have you felt being from Jordan, where your country is over a quarter of the people in that country are Palestinian refugees? You have a certain affinity for them and feel that they deserve their homeland. All of that. How have you felt either restricted or encouraged, or how have you felt regarding all the kind of current political climate and the protests and all that? And he was he was a freshman and very articulate, very even tempered, very measured in terms of how he answered this question. And he basically said, "Hey, I have to be neutral here. I can't afford to let my true heart speak for the causes I believe in, because of what the potential consequences are for those that really speak out." And it's a sad thing to hear that from a student in this day and age, that they feel they cannot say what they want on topics that are so important to them and core to who they are. So his fear is, I speak out, I might not be able to continue my studies here. I might be sent home packing. And he doesn't want that. His parents don't want that. He's got the incredible opportunity to do his undergraduate degree here in the United States, and then that will open many doors for him, hopefully. But he's really struggling, and he's made a commitment to not be political in this climate. And is it the ideal situation? No, we want him to be able to speak his mind. But if the government is acting as capriciously as it has been on this topic in particular, then it should not be a surprise that students don't want to talk up and don't want to say what they really, really feel. And probably, if they are practical, they should, until administration changes, until there's a legal ruling that says these are clear violations of free speech, these are things that the government cannot take these actions unless that's proven in a court of law and becomes standing policy and principle, then students probably shouldn't be, and as sad as that is to say, shouldn't be taking stances that are in direct opposition to this government. Is that always going to be the case? No. But this government has a very different approach to governing. And its approach to non-citizens is one that really alarms a lot of us. As an immigrant myself, who came here when I was 5 as an L2 intercompany transfer dependent, we worked through my dad's worker visa situation, became permanent residents, got our green cards, and then eventually I became a naturalized U.S. citizen before my 18th birthday. And even people who have gone through that process like me don't feel entirely comfortable, even though I've been in the country 51 years. So we really are in a very uncertain state as a country now when it comes to things outside this country and in terms of what's welcome, what's not welcome. In the past, the government this administration, first time around, said they welcome all people who go through the right channels. And ideally, we want all individuals who come to this country to do so legally and through the proper channels. The problem is, in the last 4 years, 10.5 million people did not come through those channels legally and have been let loose into the country without real tracking or monitoring at all. We don't know where most of them are. And now that was the election result in November, was in large part a reaction to that and getting back control over the immigration issue, over the border. And this administration is going completely the opposite way. And in terms of border crossings, in terms of apprehensions, all of those numbers are just proof that this current government's approach is much stricter and much more restrictive and much more legalistic than what had previously been the case in the last 4 years. So what's happened? So are we doing a good job of calming student fears? On our campuses, I think we're doing about as good as we can. But is our government giving us any indication that it's going to support what we're trying to do? Not yet. This reversal on Friday was a start, but it's a decision that never should have been in this situation in the first place, basically. So let's get to our final question of the day, and that is, will elections in Canada that just took place this past week and Australia coming up doom international education in those two countries? And it seems like all the big four countries, US, UK, Canada, Australia, are experiencing strong anti-immigrant sentiments that are forcing governments to restrict entry in various ways. We've seen Canada restricted for the last 2 years. The new government that was just elected, the Liberal Party, who was kind of continuation of Justin Trudeau's party, different leadership, obviously. It's not a majority government, so they're going to have to form a minority government, and that will mean some concessions to maybe the party in Quebec or other parties in Canada to try and come up with a majority ruling government. So in Canada, for example, the elections were just held. Liberal, the Prime Minister that was elected, Mark Carney, is in the Liberal Party, same as Justin Trudeau, kind of favored the caps that have been put in place over the last couple of years, and they are with the goal of his goal of, and the Liberal Party's goal of capping all immigration to 1%. There hasn't been specific mention on international students and what those numbers would be, but in Canada, the elections seem to be have produced both parties having either maintaining the restrictions that have been put in place, or if the Conservatives had gotten in place, it might have gotten more significant restrictions that would have tied any increases in immigration to increases in housing capacity, because that was one of the bigger reasons that led to the original led to the initial caps that were put in place in Canada over the last couple of years under the previous IRCC minister. So what I'm putting in the link here in the chat here are some articles on two from Australia, two from Canada, that kind of outline what those restrictions are, what the two parties would have. The first one on on Canada, the one most appropriate because it actually deals with specifically for international ed policy, does talk about what the article is what international students should expect from the 2025 Canadian election. So the Liberal Party under Mark Carney, the quotes from the article that Carney is committed to maintaining current immigration caps until Canada addresses key infrastructure challenges. And he says they're not adequate housing, and not everyone who came here for an education was getting an education they would expect. That he emphasized that caps will remain until we expand housing. So the temporary resident population by the end of 2025 is going to decrease another 5%, according to the Liberal approach to government there, and that they might be looking at more sustainable funding models. That he noted that transfers from provincial coffers have been frozen, leaving universities to rely completely on international students for growth. This suggests the Liberal government might work towards some more sustainable funding models while maintaining current restrictions. For international students, the article goes on, this means continued restricted access to study permits, more selective admission criteria, limited pathways to permanent residency in the short term, and a potential shift towards quality over quantity in international education. So a lot of the boom in Canada over the last decade has been in the vocational ed sector, where a lot of public-private partnerships were established between public colleges, vocational colleges in Canada, and private ones that were, in many cases, 90% international students and were just moneymakers for them as pathways for Indian students to come in and become eventual residents and workers. So it looks like the Liberal Party will continue the restrictions that have already been put in place, and and institutions should not hope for an expansion anytime soon until infrastructure needs are met. In Australia, both parties again are taking similar. Ruling party would continue their increase of fees, increase the visa crackdowns, particularly on Indian students. We've seen a ban on Australians recruiting from 6 states. Now that the visa matters are critical and will determine where Australian institutions can recruit. The opposition party has declared that there would be reduced student intakes internationally by a further 80,000. That will also ease the housing crisis and make home ownership more attainable for young Australians. So we see some very similar patterns to what's going on in Canada are playing out in Australia. This election, though, is yet to be determined, so that's coming up soon. But both do not bode well for dramatic improvements in their current situation, and in fact, restrictions will still be in place in both countries, regardless of who wins. It's just a matter of how significant those restrictions get, if they're added to or not. So a lot of uncertainty, not just in the U.S., and that's why we always talk about perspective here. And one of the questions we always focus on in the roundup is on what's going on in the rest of the world and how does that impact what we do. So we haven't talked a lot about the UK in recent weeks, but they still have their problems. A lot of universities are in some serious financial doo-doo. Visa applications are way down 40% in some cases, so that's having serious implications there. So none of the big four are doing well. There was just an IDP Emerging Futures 7 data release that'll be going live for everybody. I think today was the first day. So there's some interesting data in there in terms of how sentiment is changing toward the U.S. in terms of satisfaction and how well that bears out in terms of enrolled students this fall. Months to go yet before we know that for sure. But initial signs are that there's some real challenges still in India getting visas. So we'll see what happens along those paths over the coming weeks. So that's all we have for you this week on the Roundup. Thank you very much for joining me. Really looking forward to chatting with you in the future weeks and months, and look forward to seeing you at an upcoming conference. All the best, and until next week.